A poor little girl stood before a stranger, clutching half a piece of bread, and said just one sentence. "I think you're the last person my mom trusted." That day, a millionaire gave up everything, just to learn how to be a father. The rain had arrived without warning, sharp, whispering against the tall windows of the penthouse at 81 Mount Vernon Street. The kind of rain that blurred street lights into melancholic halos and made even the wealthiest corners of Beacon Hill feel a little lonelier. Daniel Whitaker barely noticed. His days had folded into themselves lately, marked not by sunrises but by earnings reports and acquisition forecasts. As CEO of Whitaker Capital, he was no stranger to pressure or precision. He had built a financial empire with brutal elegance, every decimal in its right place. But what he hadn't anticipated, what he had no formula for, was the knock at his door. Not the digital chime of a concierge, not the controlled buzz of a delivery. A knock, small, hesitant, human. He blinked. The hour was past 7. No meetings scheduled, no guests. He crossed the room, barefoot, glass of bourbon still in hand. When he opened the heavy oak door, he looked down and paused. Standing there was a girl, no taller than his waist, soaked from head to toe, brown curls clinging to her cheeks. She wore a red coat too large for her, sleeves covering her hands like mittens. Her eyes were green, the kind of green that stopped your breath. "Are you Daniel Whitaker?" she asked, voice barely audible over the rain. He blinked again. "Yes." She opened her hand slowly. In it was a folded piece of paper, wet around the edges but ink still legible. He took it. His fingers trembled as he read, "If you're reading this, Daniel, it means I've gone. Please listen to her. Her name is Ella. She's your daughter." It was signed, Julia Hayes. The name hit him like a freight train. He hadn't seen Julia in over 6 years. Hadn't spoken to her since the night he chose his career over love, over a woman who wanted nothing more than to build a quiet life. She'd left without a word, and now, suddenly, she was gone forever. And standing at his door was a 6-year-old consequence of that choice. He crouched down, struggling to find his breath. "Ella?" She nodded, a tremble in her lower lip. She looked exactly like Julia at that age. But there was something in her jawline, his stubbornness, his bone structure. "I'm not here for money," she said quickly, her tone oddly mature for a child. "Mom told me not to ask for anything, but she told me to come here if she didn't make it. She said you would know what to do." Daniel stared at her. His mind raced, grasping for logic, for process. He was a man of systems. This was chaos. You can't just show up. I mean, how did you—" "I took a bus," she said. "From Lowell. The woman at the hospital gave me change for fare." "The hospital?" His voice cracked. "Was she in hospice?" Ella nodded. "For 3 months. She told me about you every night. She said you were very busy, but you weren't bad. Just scared." Daniel felt something inside him break, something he'd buried. "Okay," he whispered. "Come in. You can come in." She stepped past the threshold, trailing raindrops on the mahogany floors. He called his assistant. No answer. Then legal, then security. He needed a background check, confirmation. But every call rang hollow as Ella curled up on the velvet settee like it was her home. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked. She nodded. "I can order." "I like peanut butter and banana," she said. He hesitated, then opened his fridge. Nothing but a bottle of champagne and imported yogurt. I'll run down to the store. She looked up. It's okay. You don't have to pretend. I'm used to being alone. He stopped cold. For a man worth hundreds of millions, he'd never felt so useless. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat outside her temporary bedroom, his guest room, listening to her breathe, rereading Julia's letter over and over. In it, she had written of terminal cancer, regrets, and hopes. She'd written of Daniel's strength, his brilliance, and her belief that despite everything, he had the heart of a father. She's not a burden, the letter ended. She's the best of us both. By sunrise, Daniel had made 2 decisions. 1, he would not call Child Protective Services. 2, he would get a DNA test, not to question, but to confirm, because part of him already knew. 3 days later, the results came in. 99.9% paternity match. He stood outside Ella's room, holding the paper like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She was drawing by the window. Ella, he said. She turned. Yes? You're my daughter. She blinked. I know. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the only way to stop from crying. How? She shrugged. Mom said you were the kind of man who needed proof, but I didn't. I knew the minute you opened the door. She climbed into his lap without invitation. She was light and warm and real. Daniel Whitaker, CEO of one of Boston's largest private equity firms, sat on the floor of his penthouse with a peanut butter-stained drawing in one hand and his daughter in the other. Everything was about to change. The penthouse had never known the weight of another person's breath. It had been designed for silence. Daniel Whitaker's architects had created a space where glass met stone, where sleek black counters reflected the city's skyline, and solitude was mistaken for serenity. For years, it had been his sanctuary. But now, a little girl's footsteps echoed through the marble hallways like a heartbeat in a long-abandoned cathedral. Ella did not tiptoe. She asked questions. She left peanut butter fingerprints on the kitchen island. She hummed while brushing her teeth, and when she couldn't find her socks, she wore mismatched ones on purpose. Daniel watched all of it in disbelief. This wasn't just a child. This was entropy wrapped in a red hoodie. You can't wear sneakers on the sofa, he told her on the 3rd morning. She blinked. Why not? Because it's Italian leather. She scrunched her nose. Is that like regular leather but grumpier? He didn't know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. She climbed down, slowly, and sat cross-legged on the Persian rug instead. He noticed, in that moment, how she always adjusted for his mood, how quickly she read the room, like someone who had spent her life anticipating storms before they arrived. Julia must have taught her that. At night, she drew. Always the same image, a woman standing beneath a tree, holding hands with a girl and a man whose face she never finished. Daniel watched her sketch from the hallway, too afraid to ask questions he wasn't yet ready to answer. On Thursday, the school counselor called. Mr. Whitaker, I understand you're the guardian on file for Ella Hayes. He cleared his throat. I am. This may sound forward, but Ella's name was on our transfer list at Lowell Elementary. Her mother had begun the process. It's highly unusual, but we'd like to extend an offer. She's gifted. Her testing scores, frankly, they're remarkable. Daniel stared at the phone. Gifted? Mathematically advanced, literate well beyond her age group. But more than that, empathetic, aware. One of our visiting teachers saw her read a poem aloud to a grieving student in the waiting area. She's different. Daniel whispered, She always has been. She's currently not enrolled in any district. I'd be happy to arrange testing in Boston. He agreed, then stood still for a long time after the call ended, watching Ella chase a dust mote in the morning light. He wondered how much of her life had already been shaped by grief. Later that day, he took her to the rooftop garden. It wasn't really a garden, more a manicured terrace with minimalist chairs, stone planters, and a view of the Charles River. It had always been a place for business calls, strategic thinking. Ella turned it into a picnic. She unpacked a paper bag with crackers, apples, and a thermos of hot cocoa he hadn't known the housekeeper had prepared. She sat cross-legged on a yoga mat and offered him a half-cracked plastic cup. "Cheers," she said. He knelt beside her stiffly. "To what?" "To second chances," she replied. Daniel nearly dropped the cup. "Where did you learn that?" "Mom said it every New Year's." He closed his eyes. The silence lingered between them until she asked, "Why did you and Mommy break up?" He hesitated. "It's complicated." "I can handle complicated. I read all of A Wrinkle in Time." He almost smiled. "I chose work," he finally said. "I thought it made me important." "Did it?" He didn't answer. She leaned her head against his arm. "I think being someone's dad is more important." The wind picked up. For the first time in years, Daniel felt cold where he used to feel invincible. The next morning, he took her to school registration. She wore a navy dress, a yellow backpack, and clutched his hand so tightly he felt the ghost of her fingers long after she let go. "Do I call you Dad?" she whispered in the hallway. He knelt. "Call me Daniel for now. We can figure the rest out together." She nodded solemnly. "Okay, Daniel, but I already think of you like that." Back at the penthouse, Daniel sat in his glass-walled office, surrounded by the skyline of Boston, reviewing quarterly projections for a biotech merger. Numbers made sense. They always had. But then he heard something. A soft knock. Not at the door, but at the inside of his heart. He opened his desk drawer and removed the letter Julia had sent with Ella. He read the last paragraph again. "If you open your life to her, she'll teach you more than any deal ever could. Don't protect your heart from her. She was born to rebuild it." He didn't notice the tears until they dropped onto the signature. That weekend, he tried something reckless. He took her to his mother's old lake house in Concord, untouched for years. It was still dusty, with blankets covering the furniture and silence clinging to the walls. But when they stepped inside, Ella squealed. "This smells like memories," she cried. He raised an eyebrow. "That's mildew." She danced through the hallways like a ghost in reverse, bringing life where it had once fled. And that night, under a sky full of stars and a fire he hadn't lit in a decade, she whispered, "Do you think she's watching?" "Who?" he asked. "Mom." Daniel stared into the flames. "I think she's the reason you knocked that night," he said. "I think she wanted me to find the part of myself I lost." She crawled into his lap, curled up like a cat. And he finally said it. "Good night, sweetheart." She smiled. "Good night, Dad." Daniel Whitaker had never canceled a board meeting in his life. He had walked into conference rooms mid-fever. He had negotiated mergers with a cracked rib and signed billion-dollar documents hours after burying his father. To the board of Whitaker Biomedical, Daniel wasn't just a man, he was momentum incarnate, unstoppable, inevitable. But on the morning of the quarterly review, as his assistant hovered outside the glass walls of his office and the screen flickered to life with 12 expectant faces, Daniel stared at his calendar and did something unthinkable. He clicked, "Cancel." Then he stood up and walked out, without a word. The hallway outside the penthouse pulsed with quiet luxury. Ella's new coat hung by the door. Her worn red sneakers had been replaced with canvas shoes that still looked too big for her tiny feet. Daniel stepped over a scattered trail of glitter glue and stickers leading to the kitchen. She wasn't there. He heard humming, followed it. She sat cross-legged on the balcony floor, knees tucked to her chest, a notebook resting against her thighs. She was drawing again, except this time, it wasn't a faceless man. It was Daniel. "May I see?" he asked. She looked up, startled, then blushed. "It's not done." He knelt beside her. "That's okay. I'm not either." She grinned. He took her to the Boston Public Garden that afternoon. It had rained the night before, and the benches were still wet. But Ella didn't mind. She ran through the pathways with the ferocity of a bird set free, chasing squirrels and pretending she was queen of the ducks. Daniel followed, his overcoat brushing the tops of flower beds. A week ago, he wouldn't have set foot in a public park unless it was for a fundraising gala. Now he watched a 7-year-old declare herself ruler of the swan boats. "Why aren't you at work?" she asked, climbing onto a low stone wall. "Because I'd rather be here," he answered. And to his own surprise, he meant it. Back at the office, chaos unfolded. 12 board members exchanged irritated glances on a Zoom call that never resumed. Daniel's assistant, Martha, fielded panicked messages from the legal team. Rumors stirred: illness, hostile acquisition, death. Then Daniel walked in. 3 hours late, unapologetic. He stepped into the glass conference room, straightened his coat, and said, "The meeting's postponed until Friday." Arthur Klein, the CFO, narrowed his eyes. "Daniel, with all due respect, that's not how we do things here." Daniel looked at him evenly. "It is now." Gasps rustled like paper. The truth was, Daniel hadn't just canceled the meeting. He'd changed his entire week. He canceled a business trip to Zurich, declined 2 interviews. He cleared his schedule and replaced it with something entirely foreign: presents. He made Ella breakfast. He walked her to school. He stood at the back of the auditorium while she practiced for a spelling bee, and when she nervously turned around looking for a familiar face, he raised his hand and smiled. She waved back. That night, she slipped a note under his office door. "Thank you for showing up. Love, Ella." But not everyone was charmed by the change. At Friday's rescheduled board meeting, Arthur arrived early with a printout of the company's recent news coverage. "You're becoming a liability," he told Daniel. Daniel poured coffee. "Because I'm spending time with my daughter?" "Because you're distracted. You missed the DeSalle review. You've postponed the Tokyo presentation. This isn't just about fatherhood, it's about leadership." Daniel leaned forward. "Leadership means nothing if you lose your soul." Arthur scoffed. "We're not a non-profit. We're a biotech empire." Daniel stood slowly. "Then it's time we acted like we're saving lives, and not just growing portfolios." The room fell silent. That weekend, Daniel received an invitation in the mail. It was from Lowell Elementary, handwritten in crayon. Daddy Daniel, you're invited to VIP guest day. Bring your favorite joke, and please clap the loudest. He stared at the words. Then he turned the envelope over and saw Julia's handwriting. It had been addressed months ago, likely planned before her passing. Tears welled in his eyes. She had known he would come around. He walked into Ella's room. "Am I still invited?" She grinned. "Only if you bring snacks." On Monday morning, Daniel stood at the back of Ella's classroom, a bakery box in one hand and a joke scrawled on a napkin in the other. Parents and guardians filled the tiny chairs. Some wore suits, others jeans, but none of them looked as wildly out of place as Daniel Whitaker, tech billionaire and now part-time lunch packer. Ella stood on stage, tiny fingers gripping her cue cards. She wore a sparkly headband and a pink dress he'd never seen before. Her eyes found him. And then something magical happened. She winked. She told her joke. "What did the calculator say to the math student?" "What?" the audience asked. "You can count on me!" Laughter erupted. Daniel clapped so hard his palms stung. For the first time in years, he felt weightless. That night, she crawled into his lap on the couch. The skyline sparkled behind them. "Do you think you'll always be my dad now?" she asked. "I know I will," he whispered. She rested her head on his chest, and in the stillness, he finally understood. This was the meeting he had waited his whole life to attend. It started with the fridge. More precisely, with the photo that Ella insisted on pinning to it with a purple dinosaur magnet. It showed Daniel and Ella at the Boston Public Garden, her arms wrapped around his waist, both of them mid-laugh, caught off guard by a passing vendor with a Polaroid. She called it their first real picture. "Not like the news ones," she explained, wrinkling her nose. "This one feels like us." Daniel studied the photo every morning while he poured her cereal. It became their totem, their proof. Two souls, thrown together by tragedy, now stitched into something new. And yet, some pieces were missing, gaps in the story that Julia had left behind. Until the letter came. It was a Tuesday. Rain clung to the window panes like a whisper. Daniel had just dropped Ella off at school when he found it, an envelope tucked beneath a stack of unused kitchen towels. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Julia's. His hands trembled. It wasn't postmarked, just folded, hidden. Inside, a single page. Yellowing. Ink faded in some places, but strong in others. As if she'd written it quickly, urgently, but with the clarity of someone who had finally made peace with the storm. He read it once, then again. Then he sat down and wept. Dear Daniel, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And Ella is in your life. Which means, somehow, some way, you opened the door. Thank you. I know you probably didn't expect her. I know you have questions, and guilt, and maybe anger too. But I need you to hear this first. I never hated you. Not even when I walked away. Not even when you didn't chase me. I loved you, Daniel. But I couldn't raise a child in a world that treated presence like a weakness. You weren't ready then, and I was too proud to wait. But I never meant to keep her from you. I promise. I only meant to protect her from your emptiness until you were full. If you're holding this letter, then that means you've become who I always knew you could be. Love her. That's all I ask. Love her like I did. like I still do. And when she asks about me, tell her I danced in the kitchen, even when the radio was broken. Tell her I made pancakes shaped like unicorns. Tell her I sang off key and cried during dog food commercials. Tell her I wasn't perfect, but I tried. Tell her I waited. For this. For you. With all my heart, Julia. Daniel held the letter to his chest like it was alive. The last of Julia's voice, the last of her courage, her flaws and hopes and aching faith wrapped in 8 trembling paragraphs. He sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour. When Ella came home that evening, she found him still there. "Are you okay?" she asked. He smiled gently. "I am now." Later that night, when she was brushing her teeth, he taped the letter beside the photo on the fridge. Not hidden, not folded, visible, like a lighthouse. The letter became a turning point. Daniel called his lawyer the next day and updated his will. Ella's name in black ink beside his. He also called the HR department of Whitaker Biomedical and instituted a new policy: 12 weeks of paid parental leave for all employees, fathers included. It made headlines. He didn't care. Ella asked him one night what it meant to change a legacy. He answered without thinking. "It means making sure the next person doesn't have to grow up the hard way." She looked at the letter. "Like me?" He nodded. "Like you." But not everything could be rewritten. One rainy evening, Ella asked the question he had been waiting for, and dreading. "Why didn't you come find us?" Daniel knelt beside her. "Because I didn't know about you, honey." "Not really." She studied him. "Did you love Mommy?" "With everything I had," he said softly. "But you let her go." He winced. "I let her walk away, and I didn't have the courage to follow." She tilted her head. "Why not?" "Because I thought work was more important," he admitted. "I thought success meant never stopping, never feeling." "Do you still think that?" He met her eyes. "Not anymore." Ella pulled out a sheet of printer paper from the drawer and started writing. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I'm making a new letter," she said. "For the future. So we never forget." He watched her draw a heart at the top and write, "Dear Tomorrow." He exhaled. She was 7, and already wiser than he had ever been. The next morning, Daniel opened the refrigerator to grab the milk and found a new addition under the dinosaur magnet. Ella's letter. "Dear Tomorrow, please remember that pancakes taste better when someone loves you. Also, never work so hard that you forget to laugh, or dance, or draw unicorns, especially draw unicorns. Love, Ella." He laughed, then cried, then poured 2 bowls of cereal. That afternoon, he stopped by the Boston Athenaeum, the city's oldest private library, and donated $100,000 to a new children's reading wing on behalf of Ella. He didn't tell her. He just waited. And a few weeks later, when a brick was unveiled with her name on it, she screamed so loudly it startled a nun on the library steps. That night, as she lay curled against his side, she whispered, "Do you think Mommy's proud of us?" He kissed her hair. I think she's dancing in heaven. And laughing? Definitely, she smiled. Then I'll draw her a unicorn tomorrow. The fracture came quietly. Like the slow shift of ice beneath a frozen lake, it began invisible. Silent tensions, skipped meals, a gaze held a little too long in the mirror. But when it cracked, it did so with force. Daniel had survived corporate warfare, shareholder coups, legal storms. He had stared down billion-dollar deals with a jaw of granite. But nothing, not the boardroom, not the markets, had prepared him for Ella's rage. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, after violin class. They were already late. Rain slicked the city streets, traffic honked like an orchestra of broken horns, and Ella, usually silent in the back seat, was humming something frantic and off-key. "Ella," Daniel said gently, "can we turn the volume down a bit?" She snapped. "You always turn things down. My voice, my songs, my stories. You only hear me when you want to." Daniel blinked, stunned. "Sweetheart, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean anything," she screamed. "You didn't mean to leave Mommy. You didn't mean to forget me for 7 years. You didn't mean to ruin everything, but you still did." The silence that followed was worse than the yelling. He pulled over, turned to face her. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes brimming. "Is that what you believe?" he asked softly. She wouldn't look at him. "You didn't even come to the school play." Daniel's breath caught. "I had a board meeting," he whispered. "I thought it wasn't important to—" She exploded. "It was important to me!" And with that, she burst out of the car, running into the storm. It took Daniel 3 minutes to catch up. It felt like years. She was huddled beneath the awning of a corner bookstore, sobbing. He knelt beside her, drenched, not caring. "I'm sorry," he said. "There's no excuse. I wasn't there." "I waited," she whispered. "I saved you a seat." Daniel's heart cracked in two. That night, she refused to eat. He left her favorite pasta on the table, untouched. When he peeked in her room at midnight, she was awake, staring at the ceiling. He almost walked away, but something in him, Julia's voice maybe, whispered, "Don't. Stay. Face it." He stepped in. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded. Daniel sat on the floor beside her bed, knees bent, hands folded. "I missed the play," he began. "And I missed the first 7 years of your life. Nothing I do will give those back." She didn't answer. He continued. "I keep trying to be perfect, and I keep failing. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built you the safest world, maybe you'd forgive me. But you don't want a perfect house. You want your dad." Her chin quivered. "You missed the part where I played Julia." He stared. "What?" "In the play. It was about famous women in history. I picked Mommy. I wore her scarf. And I said her favorite quote." Daniel choked. "What quote?" Ella sat up slowly. "The one on her old journal. Love loudly, even when it aches." Daniel pressed his hand to his mouth, breath unsteady. "She used to write it on the fridge," he whispered. Ella reached under her pillow and pulled out a crumpled page. "She gave this to me, a printout. I read it every night." It was the poem Julia had written the night Ella was born. "You came into the world not with thunder but with breath. And still, you shook the heavens. If they ever forget your name, let it echo in your laughter. If they ever close the door, break it down with grace. Love loudly, even when it aches. Daniel felt like someone had carved the words into his bones. He took the poem, framed it. The next day, he called a press conference. Not about quarterly earnings, not about product launches, about presence. Standing at a podium inside the Whitaker Biomedical Atrium, surrounded by journalists, investors, and bewildered executives, Daniel made a declaration. "I missed my daughter's school play," he said. The room froze. "I missed the first years of her life, because I thought being successful meant being absent." Cameras flashed. A murmur swept the room. "Effective immediately," he continued, voice firm. "Every executive at Whitaker, including myself, will take quarterly family sabbaticals. This is not a suggestion. It is policy. We cannot build futures if we abandon the present." The headlines that evening were brutal. CEO cracks under pressure, boardroom to playroom. Legacy or lunacy, Whitaker's wild pivot. But Ella didn't care. When he picked her up from school that day, she held his hand the whole walk home. That evening, they made popcorn and watched The Sound of Music. She sang every word. He hummed along, still off-key. And somewhere between My Favorite Things and Edelweiss, Ella turned to him and whispered, "I forgive you." Daniel didn't answer. He just held her hand tighter. It was the eyes that betrayed him. Not the walk, not the voice, not even the carefully chosen suit that whispered consultant, but screamed infiltrator to Daniel's seasoned instincts. No. What undid everything was the moment the man looked at Ella. And Ella flinched. They were in the lobby of the Massachusetts General Hospital. Ella had just finished a follow-up scan for her asthma, and Daniel had stepped away to take a call from the Whitaker Foundation. Ironic, really, that the very organization meant to serve families had started threatening his with its absence. He came back and saw the man kneeling beside Ella, showing her a silver coin. "You know," the man said with a grin too sharp, "this coin came from Egypt. Has a scarab right here, see?" Ella's face was blank, guarded. Daniel froze mid-step. "Excuse me," he said, voice clipped. "Can I help you?" The man rose, slow, casual. "Oh, just entertaining a curious little lady. You must be her—" "Her father," Daniel said, stepping between them. There was a pause. Then the man extended a hand. "Name's Miles Kettering. I used to know Julia. Years ago. We studied together at MIT. Daniel didn't move, didn't blink, just stared into the man's face. And there they were, Julia's eyes. Same smoky green, same wide irises that always made Julia look like she saw more than she let on. Daniel forced his hand forward. "Daniel Whitaker." "Of course," Miles smiled. "Hard to forget the name." Ella peeked around Daniel's arm, still quiet. "We were just talking about Egypt," Miles said. "Your daughter's got a historian's soul, just like her mother." And with that, he turned. "Lovely seeing you both." As he walked away, Daniel felt his stomach twist. He told himself it was coincidence. MIT was a small world. Julia had dozens of friends. The eyes meant nothing. But when he got home that evening, Ella pulled something from her coat pocket. "The man gave me this," she said. It was a coin. Silver. Etched with a scarab. But it wasn't the coin that chilled Daniel. It was what was written on a folded slip of paper inside the coin pouch. Julia and I never got to finish the conversation. Some stories deserve their last chapter. Ask her about Rome. Monsieur Daniel sat down, legs weak. That night he pulled out Julia's old journals. They were stored in a cedar chest, buried beneath blankets she had knitted, baby booties still sealed in a plastic bag, and a copy of Goodnight Moon with Julia's scrawled handwriting in the margins. It took him 2 hours to find the one he was looking for, the Rome trip. Summer before her second year of grad school. Daniel had always thought of it as the month Julia disappeared into herself. She returned pale, quiet, and distracted. A month later, she broke off their engagement. He opened the journal, skimmed pages. Then he stopped. There, in looping script, dated July 13th. Miles showed up in Trastevere again. He keeps saying he loves me, that he'll leave his job, move to Boston. But I told him I was already engaged, that there was someone I couldn't unlove, even if he broke my heart with silence sometimes. But Miles says it isn't over. He says there are things I don't know, that someday I'll understand, and part of me is scared he's right. Daniel's hands trembled. The next morning he called Julia's best friend Meredith. They hadn't spoken in years, not since the funeral. "Daniel," she said, surprised, "is Ella okay?" "She's fine," he said, "but I'm not." He told her about Miles, the coin, the letter, the journal. There was a pause. Then Meredith exhaled. "You weren't supposed to know." "What?" "Julia never wanted you to find out. Not unless it mattered." "Find out what?" "That Miles, he's not just an old friend. He's Ella's godfather." The world blurred. "She made me promise," Meredith said, "that if anything happened to her, I'd keep Miles out of it. He'd always been complicated." "Why?" "Because he was in love with her, and because he knew things she never told you." Daniel felt the weight of 10 years crash on his shoulders. That evening he sat across from Ella at the kitchen table. She was coloring, a robin, red against a green spring tree. "Ella," he said, voice careful, "do you remember what the man in the hospital said?" She nodded. "He knew Mommy." Another nod. He paused. "How did that make you feel?" She looked up. "Weird." "Weird how?" He knew her laugh, but not the way you do. Daniel blinked. "What do you mean?" "You know how Mommy used to laugh quiet first, then loud? Like a pop?" She giggled, imitating it. He didn't know that part. He only remembered the loud part. Daniel smiled, then frowned. It was a child's observation, but a damning one. That night, Daniel made a decision. He drove to the last address Julia had written in the Rome Journal, a brownstone in Cambridge, quiet, well-kept, unassuming. He knocked, and the door opened. Miles stood there holding a steaming mug. "Took you long enough," he said. Daniel didn't reply. He stepped in. The confrontation lasted hours. They talked about Julia, her letters, the Rome trip, the argument that split her from both men. "She didn't want to choose," Miles said at last. "But she did. She chose you, even when you were too buried in ambition to see her pain." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And you thought showing up now would fix that?" "I thought maybe it would fix something in me." They sat in silence. Then Miles reached for a drawer, pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a ring. Antique. Delicate. Ruby center. "I bought it in Rome," he said. "For her. She never wore it. Said her heart already belonged elsewhere." Daniel stared at the ring. It shimmered like guilt, like grief. He left the brownstone with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The past was not done with him. And Ella, his Ella, deserved the truth. All of it. Even the parts that hurt. Daniel had never liked family trees. In third grade, he faked an entire ancestry for a school project, pasting photos of random Civil War generals onto branches labeled great-great-grandpa, just to avoid asking his emotionally distant parents for help. The only real name he'd used was his grandmother's, Evelyn Whitaker. The rest was fiction, a tree with no roots. Now, at 39, he was standing in the dining room with a pencil in hand and a blank sheet of paper on the table, while his 8-year-old daughter sat across from him, eyes wide, cautious. Ella didn't speak. She simply waited, crayons clutched in her fist. Daniel took a breath. "We're going to draw our family tree together, okay?" She tilted her head. "Is this for school?" "No. This is for us." There was a silence. Then she pulled a green crayon from her pack and made a tiny leaf in the top left corner. "One leaf for Mommy," she said softly. Daniel's hand tightened around the pencil. "That's perfect." He had rehearsed the conversation all night. How to explain to a little girl that her mother had loved more than one man. How to tell her that love, sometimes, wasn't tidy. That people made choices not out of betrayal, but out of confusion, youth, fear. But when it came time to speak, he found himself stumbling. "Ella, there's someone I want you to know about." She looked up. "His name is Miles Kettering. He was someone your mom knew a long time ago." Ella said nothing. Her crayon hovered midair. Daniel continued. "He's your godfather." Her brows lifted. "Like in movies?" He chuckled lightly. "Kind of, but real. Mommy never told you about him because she wanted to wait until the time was right." "Why now?" He hesitated. "Because he's back. And I think you deserve to know where you came from. All of it. Even the parts that are complicated." They built the tree slowly. Daniel drew the base, himself and Julia. Ella insisted on drawing little hearts between the names. Then they added Evelyn, his grandmother, and Julia's parents, whom Ella had only known through old photos and Sunday stories. Finally, Daniel drew a dotted line on the side, next to Julia, and wrote, "Miles, Godfather." Ella stared at it. Then, without saying a word, she drew a small owl beside his name. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "He told me about ancient coins," she said. "Owls mean wisdom." He couldn't speak for a moment. He just nodded. That night, Daniel called Miles. He didn't want to, but he also didn't want to keep lying. By omission, by silence, by fear. "Miles," he said once the man picked up. "Ella wants to meet you, but on one condition." "Anything," Miles replied quickly. "You don't talk about the past. Not your version of it. Not until I say she's ready." "I understand." "And you respect boundaries. You come as a guest, not family, not yet." There was a pause. Then, understood. They met at a small botanical garden just outside the city. Ella wore a yellow sundress and brought a notebook titled Secret Questions for Grown-Ups. Miles brought a box of dried flowers pressed in wax paper, Julia's favorite hyacinths. They sat on a bench near the koi pond. Daniel kept his distance, close enough to listen, far enough to give space. Ella opened her notebook. Question 1. Do you believe in ghosts? Miles blinked, then grinned. Only the kind that smell like jasmine and leave poetry on windows. Ella nodded. Good answer. Question 2. What did you love most about Mommy? Miles looked down, then back up. Her laugh, but not the loud part, the part right before. Ella stared at him. Daniel froze behind the bushes. Then she wrote something in her notebook, folded the page, and handed it to Miles. Next time, you can ask me questions. He took the page like it was made of glass. Thank you, he whispered. On the drive home, Ella fell asleep in the back seat. Her notebook clutched to her chest. Daniel glanced at her through the mirror. He didn't know what the future held between Miles and Ella. Whether this godfather role would remain symbolic or blossom into something deeper. But for the first time in weeks, there was no weight in his chest. Only breath. Full, clean breath. Two days later, Daniel received a package. Inside was a tree, a bonsai, elm, and a note. Every tree begins with broken roots. Let's keep building it, one leaf at a time. M. Daniel didn't smile. But he placed the bonsai on the windowsill in Ella's room, right beside the terrarium with Julia's jade turtle figurine. He watched the wind rustle the tiny leaves and whispered, We're trying, Jules. We're really trying. The morning was cool, quiet. The kind of October day when the air feels like silk and the leaves rustle like pages turning on their own. Daniel stood at the foot of the old attic stairs, holding a box he hadn't opened in years. Julia's handwriting was still scrawled across the label. For rainy days and remembering. He opened it slowly. Inside was a worn sweatshirt, the edges of a baby blanket, a faded concert ticket. And at the very bottom, inside a velvet pouch, a ring. Not her wedding band. This one had no diamonds, no gold, just a slender silver band engraved on the inside with the words, In any life, I'd find you. Daniel sat down on the attic floor. The air tasted like dust and longing. He remembered the first time he gave her that ring. It wasn't for a proposal. It was after they'd nearly broken up during their junior year at Tufts. He'd been scared of her dreams, of his own smallness. She'd planned to study abroad in Florence. He thought it meant she was leaving him. I'm not leaving you, she'd said in the rain, hair plastered to her face. I'm finding me, so I can come back and love you better. And she had. That night, he took the ring to Ella. She was sitting on her bed, braiding a ribbon for her doll's hair. Her eyes flicked up as he entered. Did Mommy wear jewelry? She asked suddenly, as if her thoughts had summoned the moment. Daniel smiled gently. Only one thing all the time. This. He sat beside her, placing the ring in her palm. Ella's eyes grew wide. She wore it before we got married, he explained, when she was still learning how to trust love. Ella turned the ring over carefully. It's small. She said love didn't need to be loud to be strong. There was a long silence. Then very softly she asked, "Can I keep it?" He nodded. "I was hoping you would." She slipped it onto a chain around her neck, beside the tiny silver turtle charm that had belonged to Julia. Daniel watched her, this tiny, quiet girl who carried more memories than most adults. She whispered, "I won't lose it." "I know," he said. "You never lose anything that matters." But the past had a strange way of knocking when you least expected it. The next morning, Daniel received an email. From Miles. Subject line, "Urgent." Inside, only one line. "You need to come to the Boston Medical Center. It's about Julia. Please bring the ring." Daniel stared at the screen. What could possibly remain? Julia had been gone for 8 years. He didn't know what scared him more. The idea that Miles had found something, or that Julia had kept something even he hadn't known. The hospital smelled like bleach and secrets. Miles met him in the lobby, his face pale but steady. "There's someone I need you to meet," he said. "She was with Julia, near the end." Daniel stiffened. "I was with her till the end. Not the medical end, the Florence end." Daniel blinked. "You mean, before she came back?" Miles nodded. "She left something behind. Something she meant to bring home, but never could." They walked in silence until they reached the palliative research wing. Inside was a woman named Dr. Isabella Conti, Italian, mid-60s, hair pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were the same soft storm gray as Julia's. "You must be Daniel," she said gently. He nodded, suddenly unsure of who he was anymore. "I was Julia's mentor in Florence. She confided in me a great deal, including something she wanted you to have." Dr. Conti pulled out a small envelope from her coat. Inside was a folded letter, aged and creased. Daniel opened it. "Danny, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get to tell you myself. I loved you, more than you ever knew. But before I found you again, I lost something in Florence. A part of me I didn't understand yet. I met a child there. Not mine, not by blood. But something in her made me see how badly I wanted to be a mother. That child died of a disease I couldn't pronounce in a clinic with broken windows. That's why I came home to you ready. Ready to be a mother. Ready to fight for more. That ring you gave me, I buried it once, in the dirt outside that clinic. I dug it up again the night before I left. I didn't want to leave a promise in a place where no one could keep one. Wear it for me, if I'm gone. Or better, give it to someone who might grow into it. Love is the only thing we carry into the next life. Jules." Daniel couldn't speak. He just sat, letter shaking in his hands, tears clinging to his lashes. All those years, he had thought Julia's need for motherhood had simply been romantic, impulsive. He hadn't known it had come from such a deep, quiet ache. He thought of Ella, of the way she cradled dolls like they had souls, the way she asked about ghosts and dreams and promises. He looked at Miles. "You knew?" Miles shook his head. "Not until last week. I went to Florence to close a donor deal for the pediatric clinic. Dr. Conti mentioned Julia's name. I followed the thread." Daniel stood. "I want to go there," he said. "To Florence?" "No, to that clinic, with Ella, to see the tree Julia planted, the one near the dirt she buried the ring in." Dr. Conti smiled. "It's still there, an olive tree, with roots deeper than the bricks. Back at home that night, Daniel knelt by Ella's bed. "Would you ever want to see where Mommy studied when she was your age?" he asked softly. Ella opened her eyes, sleepy but curious. "Like a field trip?" He nodded. "A very long one, to Italy." She smiled. "Can we bring the ring?" "Absolutely," he said. And with that, the past became a bridge, not a chain. They arrived in Florence under a sky the color of parchment, soft and quiet, like the city had been waiting. Ella pressed her nose to the taxi window as they wound through narrow streets. "Everything looks like it's from a fairy tale." Daniel smiled faintly. "Your mom used to say the same thing." It was strange being back. The scent of espresso and stone dust, the distant chiming of the Duomo bells. But more than anything, it was the weight of something he couldn't name pressing against his ribs. Like a song half remembered. Dr. Conte met them at the gates of the old pediatric clinic, now restored and humming gently with volunteers and laughter. The olive tree still stood by the side, small but rooted, its leaves silver and whispering. "This is the place," she said, "where Julia used to sit every morning, writing in her journal." Ella reached out and touched the tree. "It's warm," she whispered. Dr. Conti nodded. She said it always was, even in winter. Inside the clinic, the children ran barefoot through the tiled corridors, laughter echoing off the plaster walls. Daniel sat beside Dr. Conte near the courtyard and opened the faded leather journal Julia had once left in her attic trunk, the one he never dared read fully until now. But as he flipped through the pages, a folded napkin slipped out. On it was a date, March 22nd, 2016, and a name, Marta Gianetti. Daniel blinked. That was the night Julia told him she'd stayed late at the library. She'd called it the longest night of my life. He remembered because it was the only time in their marriage he'd suspected her of lying. She'd come home at 3 a.m., eyes red, hands trembling. She'd said it was just a research marathon. He hadn't pushed. But now, here was evidence that something else had happened. "Who's Marta Gianetti?" he asked quietly. Dr. Conte froze. "That was the name of the child who died," she said softly. 8 years old. She was very close to Julia. Ella looked up from the other side of the courtyard. "Is that the girl from the letter?" Daniel nodded. "She died on March 22nd, Dr. Conti said, her voice low. Julia was with her when it happened." Daniel's stomach dropped. "All this time," he whispered, "I thought she was hiding from me, but she was grieving." "Some things we carry alone," Conte replied, "especially the ones we don't know how to name." That evening, Daniel stood in front of the old church where Julia had lit a candle the morning after Marta passed. He lit one now, and beside him, Ella did too. "I don't think Mommy lied," Ella said, holding the flame close. "I think she just didn't want to give you her pain." Daniel swallowed hard. "Maybe I should have asked more. Maybe she needed you to just be there." They stood in silence, the candle flames dancing between them like silent apologies. Then Ella said something that stilled the air. "She said she didn't want to be a ghost," she whispered. Daniel turned slowly. "Who said that?" "Mommy. I heard her. Last night in the dream." Daniel's breath caught. "What did she say?" Ella looked up, her face steady in the candlelight. "She said, 'Don't let the night I couldn't share be the one that defines me.'" Daniel closed his eyes. The ache that had sat in his chest for 8 years. The ache born of suspicion, guilt, of imagining she'd pulled away, shifted. She hadn't disappeared from him. She'd broken, and hadn't known how to let him in. Back at the little bed and breakfast overlooking the Arno, Daniel sat on the balcony while Ella slept. He took out the journal again and turned to the March 22nd entry. It wasn't a page of poetry or longing. It was a confession. I watched a child die tonight. I held her hand and lied to her. I said she'd see her mother again. She said she wanted to be a painter. She was 8. Her lungs stopped at 10:43 p.m. Danny, if I come home and smile, it's because I have to. Because I need to remember joy doesn't die when a body does. But I don't know how to be the same again. I don't know how to be enough for you and carry this. So tonight, I leave it here, in this book. Because tomorrow, I come home. Daniel wept. Not out of grief, but out of recognition. He finally understood the night she came home and didn't speak. The way she had curled up on the floor instead of going to bed. The way she'd clung to him like the world was falling. She had buried a child and carried it inside her silence. The next morning, Daniel and Ella walked back to the olive tree. Ella knelt beside it and began digging softly with her fingers. "What are you doing?" he asked gently. "Looking for the place Mommy buried the ring," she said. "Even if she took it back, I want to find the place." After a few moments, she uncovered a flat stone. Beneath it, just earth. But as she dug further, her fingers brushed something cold. Not a ring, a locket. Inside was a photo of Julia, young, wind-blown, beside a girl with paint smudges on her cheeks. Marta. On the back was etched, "Art doesn't die." Ella held it to her heart. "I want to be a painter too," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "Then we'll get you brushes, and walls, and colors that never fade." That evening, as the sun set over the Ponte Vecchio, Daniel and Ella stood on the bridge. He pulled out a small box. Inside, a new ring. This one was silver, just like Julia's. But on the inside, a new inscription. "What love remembers, it carries forward." He gave it to Ella. "Not to wear yet," he said, "but to keep. Until you're ready to give it to someone you love the way your mom loved you." Ella nodded solemnly. "I'll wait," she said, "for someone who carries stories." They walked back in silence, the city glowing around them, the ghosts quiet now. Not because they were gone, but because they had finally been heard. There were no fireworks when they returned. No grand declarations or newspaper headlines. Just 2 suitcases and a girl carrying a locket in one hand and a sketchbook in the other. Daniel stepped back into the Beacon Hill townhouse, once echoing with silence, now filled with small but significant noise. The ticking of clocks he hadn't wound in years, the shuffle of Ella's shoes as she ran to the kitchen, the way her laughter stuck to the walls like sunlight after rain. He set down his bag, took a deep breath. It no longer smelled of absence. Ella placed her sketchbook on the dining table, flipped to a half-drawn page. It was Florence, the olive tree, the clinic courtyard, and Julia sitting beside the tree. The colors weren't perfect, but the emotion was. "You kept her warm," Ella whispered to the page. Daniel turned away to hide his tears. There was nothing fragile about her anymore. She had lived through it, carried the weight of knowing, and still chose beauty. He picked up the kitchen calendar. He crossed out the rest of the board meetings for the month, then took a pen and wrote in bold, "Saturday, Ella's gallery opening." It wasn't in a real gallery, just the community center near Cambridge, where local children displayed their paintings. But her name was on the flyer, and that mattered more than any earnings call he'd ever led. By April, they'd painted the spare room into a studio. Daniel let her pick the color, a soft periwinkle blue, and covered the walls with cork panels so she could pin her sketches. The ceiling had glow-in-the-dark stars. She named them. He spent evenings reading beside her as she painted. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But the silence was never empty now. One night she looked up and said, "Daddy, I think I want to teach art when I grow up, to kids in hospitals." He looked at her long and slow, like her mother used to do. "You already are." At the foundation board meeting in May, Daniel arrived with a different agenda. He brought no charts, no legal pads, just Julia's journal. He handed a copy to each trustee. "This," he said, "is the reason we were ever in business." There was silence as they read the first page. A few looked uncomfortable, others stunned. One man, Peter Lang from the Finance Committee, took off his glasses. Daniel stood tall. "We will no longer fund things that increase shareholder value without increasing human dignity. From today, every project we approve must pass through a new filter. Does this heal? Does this help?" There were no objections. Not this time. He let go of the townhouse on Beacon Street in July. Sold it quietly, without sentimentality. Too many ghosts. Too many cold winters. They moved to a modest cottage in Lexington. A white fence, a wide porch, a cherry blossom tree that bloomed too early. Ella hung her locket beside the window, and every night before bed, she looked at it and whispered, "We're okay." He believed her. Autumn came with cinnamon in the air and a different kind of grief. The quiet ache of knowing Julia wouldn't see Ella's first art class or her first full canvas. But grief softened, like water smoothing stone. At the annual gala of the Julia Price Foundation, Daniel didn't wear a tux. He wore the same wool coat Julia had once teased him about. Ella stood beside him in a red dress. "I want to say something," she whispered. He handed her the mic. She took a deep breath, her voice clear in the grand hall. "My mommy believed that children deserve art and hope and someone who listens. My daddy believed that work was the most important thing. But now he believes in me, so I think we're even." Laughter, applause, and something better than both, understanding. She continued, softer this time. "I used to think when someone dies, they're just gone. But now I think they stay, in colors, in smells, in the way people who love them carry them forward." Then she turned to her father. "And I think he's carrying her very well." The last page of Julia's journal read, "If you find this, it means I didn't get to finish the story. But maybe that's how it should be. Maybe the rest is yours to write." Daniel framed it, hung it beside Ella's first full canvas. It was a painting of the three of them, standing beneath the olive tree in Florence. Ella had added something that never happened in real life. Julia's hand was on Daniel's shoulder, and in her other hand she held Ella's.